This is a problem I think most creationists become aware of pretty quickly. I know I did a half century ago. I was finishing high school, starting college, and decided to become a creation scientist, more specifically an astronomer. And this was naturally a very important question to me, and I've wrestled with the question for decades ever since. I think my title slide here illustrates the problem very nicely. This object is called NGC 4676. That's the catalog number of this. It's a couple of interacting galaxies. The distance for these is about 300 million light years, so they're pretty far away, and quite a bit more than 6,000 light years, obviously. And you can see strong evidences of some ongoing processes, some past processes, and still going on. These are a couple of, I think, spiral galaxies. I can see the disk on the right side there, kind of nearly edge on. The one on the left is not so edge on, but in between and even beyond that to the left, there's a lot of asymmetry showing up in these two galaxies. They're orbiting each other, and this takes time for this to happen. And of course, you have to have time to get the light here, it would seem. So very quickly put, the definition of the problem is this. The world, we believe, was created in 6 normal days, and that was about 6,000 years ago. You get that by looking at the chronologies and genealogies in the Bible. We have about a little over 2,000 years from the creation to Abraham, and we have about 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ. And we know from history that Christ was here about 2,000 years ago. So you add that up, you get about 6,000 years. I think it's a little more than that, but not much more. It's far less than millions or billions, as you might think. And yet we see these objects much farther away than 6,000 light years. Again, here's another example. I have my slide here. This is the Andromeda Galaxy. This is usually the most distant object that you can see with your naked eye. It requires a dark, clear night away from the city, no bright moon. And if you do this late summer into autumn, it's an easy thing to see in the sky. I have no trouble finding it in a dark sky. A bright sky, different story. Where I live today, I need binoculars to find it. But if I'm in a dark area, I can pick out the Andromeda Galaxy very easily. And we believe it's a little over 2 million light years away from us. So it presents a problem. Now, most of the stars we see at night are not that nearly that far. They're a few hundred light years typically. The most distant stars you might see with your naked eye would be a couple of thousand light years away, maybe 3,000 light years away, certainly less than 6,000 light years, but still pretty far away. The closest star outside of the sun, of course, is a little more than 4 light years away from us. So, how did the light get here? It would seem that simply looking at this 6,000 years, you shouldn't see any more than 6,000 light years. And yet, we see things that are millions and even billions of light years away. The most distant galaxies we're now seeing with the most sensitive detectors, the largest telescopes, are in excess of 10 billion, with a B, 10 billion light years away. So much of the universe is beyond 6,000 light years. 6,000 light years is nothing. That's just not even your front yard, almost speaking cosmologically. Now, that's the way generally people look at it. They say, well, how can we see anything more than 6,000 light years away? But it occurs to me that this really isn't properly formulating the problem. I think we need to look at the problem a little more basic than that, because I think the situation's worse than this. As bad as it is, the situation is far, far worse than we generally would think. So, what do I mean by that? Well, here's a star chart showing the constellation Centaurus, and down in the lower left, you'll see kind of a magenta-looking arrow, a short arrow pointing to a star. That's Alpha Centauri. That's the closest star system to us. The brighter star there is Alpha. We call it A. There's also a B and C component. The B is orbits kind of close to A, but C is pretty far away. C is sometimes called Proxima Centauri. It's technically a little closer to us, but for the sake of argument, I'll just say Alpha Centauri is the closest star. And we do know that from the creation account, stars were made on day 4, just 3 days from day 1. And we know that Adam was made 2 days later on day 6. So you take 6 and subtract 4. Well, he was just made 2 days, as I said, later. but Alpha Centauri is 4.3 light years away. Now, seeing the sun isn't a problem. It's only 8 light minutes away, and seeing the moon is only 1.5 seconds. The planets are typically 10, 20, 50, maybe an hour, hour and a half. So seeing them would not be that difficult at all. You've got plenty of time for their light to get here if they're made on day 4 before Adam shows up on day 6. Now, how the question is, how could Adam see any stars at all? And I'm of the opinion that he probably did see stars. In fact, he probably saw the sky pretty much the way we see it today. On that last the end of day 6, sun sets. It's now day 7 in Hebrew reckoning. It gets dark. Adam and Eve look up for the first time in the heavens, and they see probably pretty much what we see today. And why do I say that? Well, the stars have certain functions, certain purposes given to them, the day 4 account, and along with the sun and the moon. But those purposes could not be fulfilled without them being visible. Now, the sun gives us the reckoning of the day and the year because each day it moves across the sky, but also it moves once a year around us, if you will, or we're moving around it. It doesn't matter if it's geocentric or heliocentric. The observation says the sun moves around us once a year. Well, how do we know it's moving? Well, because we can see it move with respect to background stars. We have right now stars of summer out there in the evening. It's time. But in a few months, we'll have stars of autumn and then stars of winter. 6 months from now, we'll have stars of winter. And the stars of winter are located around where the sun is right now. And the stars of summer are located where the sun will be in 6 months. We're looking away at night, looking away from where the sun is right now in the opposite direction. So without that backdrop of stars, timekeeping would be very difficult. Seasons would be difficult to determine. You need that background of stars in order for the sun to fulfill some of its purpose as well. So without those purposes to be fulfilled, and that you have a problem, particularly when it says at the end of the creation week everything was very good, and that very good, large part of that is referring to the creation being complete and fulfilling the purposes and functions that they were intended to do. I think that's a large part of what that very good is talking about there. So how do we solve this problem? So let me step back a second. What I'm pointing out here is that Adam had a starlight problem. Um, we stress over seeing the most distant objects in the universe, but if you apply the same sort of reasoning to Adam, you realize that he would have a difficult time seeing the closest stars to us. I don't think he waited after 4 years and there comes Alpha Centauri, and then another 4 years later, there's Sirius. I think he saw it all. So if we can solve Adam's little problem, I think it solves our problem too. And I think far too many times we're really worried about solving our problem when we really ought to be solving Adam's problem, Adam's lifetime problem. Well, there have been several suggested solutions. One of the most common, one of the oldest we have, is the mature creation or light created in transit. I'm going to discuss several of these. I'm not going to go in great detail. I don't think I need to. Henry Morris was a large fan of this one. The argument is that the God didn't make the animals as babies or eggs. He didn't make Adam as a baby or a youngster. He created them as adults. And so, in like manner, God made them God made them mature. He made the the universe mature as well. And I think there's a certain amount of logic to that. I think there's a lot of consistency to that. The problem I have always had with this is the fact that it's not a matter of just seeing stars, seeing the light of the stars. We see all sorts of detailed information in the light of the stars. For instance, in 1987, we saw I didn't see it because it was in the southern hemisphere and I wasn't there at the time, but there was a naked eye supernova, the first one in 4 centuries. And it was in a small satellite galaxy of the Milky Way. This galaxy is called the Large Magellanic Cloud, the LMC for short. And the problem is that galaxy, and hence the supernova, are about 170,000 light years away from us, quite a bit more than 6,000. And The problem is, over the last 30 some years, we've seen a lot unfold there. There was a tremendous amount of evidence from the light curve that people examined. We saw evidence of radioactive decay going on, and this thing as it expanded outward. We saw a development of a remnant developing there. We saw a light echo, also detailed information, the light curve, the spectrum, the whole thing. By the way, just a few days this week, there was a preliminary announcement, I think saw today or yesterday, of a possible detection of a neutron star left behind, which is interesting. After all these years, we finally see the thing left behind there, not just the debris cloud around the thing. And yet, none of that ever happened. If this solution's correct, it's like God implanted into the light traveling to us detailed information about processes that never happened. It's not a matter of us surmising these processes must have happened. We actually watched them take place. And so we're seeing these things that evidence of things that never happened. And that bothers me philosophically and theologically to a large extent. And it bothered other people as well. And so over the past 30, 40 years, we've had other people suggesting other alternate solutions. One was pioneered by Barry Setterfield back in the 1980s. He thought he found evidence that the speed of light was changing. Sometimes people call this CDK, which is kind of a shorthand and a play on words. C being what the representation we use for the constant speed, what we think is the constant speed of light, and DK as a phonetic spelling of the word decay, DECAY. So the idea of CDK is that the speed of light is decreasing, and Barry Setterfield thought he found some evidence that historical measurements of the speed of light was actually decreasing, and he suggested perhaps in the past it was infinite or near infinite during the creation week, and it's exponentially decayed down to no change anymore, which seems a trifling bit uh, convenient in my estimation. I don't think the data really support it. You can take the data that he found, historic measurements, and reinterpret it in terms of a constant speed of light. And also, its speed of light's not something you can just willy-nilly change. It depends upon a couple of fundamental constants. We call it the permeability and the permittivity of free space. And these determine the structure of matter in the universe. And we see no evidence that it's ever changed. So it was kind of exciting back in the 80s when this first came along, but slowly but surely other people began to think long and hard about it, and there are a number of papers written about it. And so it's not nearly as popular as it once was, but there's still people out there holding on to it. And of course, at the 1994 ICC, the International Conference on Creationism, Russ Humphreys presented what he called his white hole cosmology, the idea that during the creation week, God created the universe as a white hole, which then shrank away probably by day 4. And he relied upon some relativistic effects of general relativity here to cause the time to progress at different rates. You could have billions of years taking place in the rest of the universe while only maybe a few days transpired on the Earth. Ultimately, this is a long, old age universe solution. Most people have not really recognized that, but it is. But you're having your cake and eating it too, because it's still only a 6-day recent creation for the Earth and near Earth environments. This remains a popular solution for a lot of people. However, many people don't know this, but a few years ago, Russ actually moved beyond this, abandoned that for favor of a different model, again, relying upon general relativity. I simply refer to that as Humphreys 2.0, white hole cosmology being 1.0. And Dr. Humphreys continues to refine and change that model as he sees fit. So stay tuned. If you're still thinking white hole, well, you've been keeping up with what Russ Humphreys has been doing. And then inspired by that, John Hartnett in Australia, he's a physicist that specializes in metrology, the study of measurements of things. And he began to study an alternative metric for the general relativity. Generally, have a 4-dimensional metric called the Robertson-Walker metric, and what an Italian physicist named Carmelli came up with was a 5-dimensional, a dimension added in there, velocity dimension thrown in, and an alternate form of general relativity. And so John Hartnett met with Carmeli, studied his work, and began to adapt that to a recent creation sort of model, doing a bit differently from what Russ Humphreys was working on, but again, following general relativity. I think perhaps Professor Hartnett's backed away from that a little bit in recent years. And then finally, we had also Jason Lyle's anisotropic synchrony convention, ASC for short, because it's a lot easier to pronounce. And this again is dealing with general relativity, and it comes down to conventions about the speed of light. And I think a lot of people who think they understand this, what Jason's saying here, don't quite understand what he's saying. As it turns out, it's kind of coming down to semantics, almost dealing with this. I at various times I've liked each of these solutions to a point, but I have problems with all of them. One of these people tried to enlist me 15 years ago, and asked me what my problems were with it, and I said, well, of the different solutions, I dislike yours the least, and he was amused by that. So, at any rate, I think I see advantages and disadvantages to all of them, which means I keep looking. Well, I've been cogitating on this, I guess, probably a dozen years, and as I did, it took me a while to finally distill what I was thinking about. And I need to go back and do a review of the creation week just a little bit. We have the word bara that occurs several times in the creation count. Whenever you see the word create in an English translation, that's the word that's being used there. And many times people say it speaks of ex nihilo creation. I don't know if that's quite true. And on top, but more importantly, they say it's something new. That may be true, but more importantly, bara is a verb that's only used with God as a subject. Apparently, men can do other things that God can do, but we can't bara. We can't create in the way that God can create. So that's one word that's used in the creation week. And the word asa is another word that's used. And whenever you see the word made or make in the creation account, that's the word that's being used there. And unlike bara, men can asa things. Later on in the Bible, the Old Testament, people do asa. They make things. And that's sometimes thought of as being fashioning things out of existing material. I don't much quarrel with that, because in that sense we have to start with something before we can make anything. And God certainly fashioned things out of, he created matter and energy early on, and then later on in the creation week he came back and formed things. He made them out of that. Now sometimes the words bara and asa are interchanged. Man is said to be created and made both. And so many people argue that, well, the two are completely interchangeable. I don't think they are necessarily. I think in some cases they can be, but I think to just simply say the two are absolutely equivalent to one another and they're simply used for variety, I think is perhaps making too many assumptions about them. I think there might be some overlap. In fact, I know there's some overlap, but other cases I suspect that they don't overlap as much. Now, the day 4 account consistently uses asa, which I take from that it's probably God fashioning things out of matter that he created earlier in the week. Now, some people, some creationists, when they hear me say that, they're thinking, oh, there's eternal matter or matter before the creation week. No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying that God may have created things ex nihilo on day 1, matter, but then he fashioned it on day 4. I kind of go back and forth on this. About whether God created ex nihilo things on day 4 or if he made them, but I'm certainly open to the possibility, usually, that he fashioned things out of matter that he created early in the creation week there on day 4. Now, a couple important considerations. One, as creation scientists, we often underestimate the role of the miraculous during the creation week. I think most of us realize that the creation of matter, space, energy, and time were pretty miraculous. There's no physical explanation for that. The creation of life is also a miraculous thing. There's no explanation for that. And there are a number of other things that I think during the creation week, I think we would understand if we were witnesses, could have been witnesses to that. We would realize that this is not the way things normally work. Yet, when it comes down to this question of starlight and time, too many times we want a physical explanation. So, well, wait a minute, that's pretty inconsistent. You want to invoke the miraculous so much during the creation week, but then when it comes down to one issue, you're going to have to demand that God only operated within the physics as we know it today, more specifically general relativity. Hopefully, you can see where I'm aiming at this point. Um, why you might as well give me a physical explanation for the virgin birth and resurrection while you're at it. There are many things we recognize as being miraculous. So why can't this be miraculous as well? And uh, I think there's a difference going on. Hebrews 1:3 and Colossians 1, 13, 14, 16 talks about the current sustaining of this world, upholding the creation by the power of his word. And that strikes me as even being miraculous moment by moment. I think if God stopped sustaining the world, it would probably cease to exist. The only problem is because it's done consistently day in and day out, we take that as the norm. That is the non-miraculous. And this sustaining is done with pattern. It's done with consistency, and that's really kind of the foundation of the development of science 4 centuries ago. You had a working hypothesis that there was order and patterns in the creation, because God is a God of order and God of decrees, and that's why we look for physical laws. We look for patterns for these things. So it's no accident that modern science as we know it rose in Europe, particularly Protestant Europe at the time. It's a certain worldview that you have to have there. But was this operating back into the past? Well, obviously not. The first verse of the Bible suggests that there's a lot of non-physical things going on in other days of creation as well. So I'm sort of the opinion now that perhaps physics as we know it, which is a study of those patterns I just mentioned, develop maybe gradually throughout the week. Certainly by the end of business of day 6, beginning of day 7, physics as we know it was, including the second law of thermodynamics, by the way, were all in place. But did God put pieces of it in place as the week goes by? Well, we don't have enough information to say for sure if that's the case. Well, the other point I want to make is, could we interpret events of one day of the creation week in terms of other days? That is, if we see certain things taking place on other days of the creation week, could we then maybe surmise, not impose, but surmise that maybe the same sort of processes were going on other days? That is, if I can see something going on and say, for the sake of argument, day 3, maybe God used the same pattern on day 4, because you see, there's not a lot of specifics on what happened on day 4. We're told God made the luminaries, here are the purposes, and 3 times he says where he put them in the expanse of heaven. But other than that, we don't have a lot of information. So I'm grasping for information as an astronomer here. I want to know what was going on these. I mentioned the day 3 account, not hypothetically at all, because I'm really interested in what's going on there. It says there in verse 10 or 11, it says, let the earth, and the King James says, let the earth bring forth grass, and it mentions other plants as well. And then the next verse says, and the earth brought forth, and the same plants are described. Now, what I find interesting is I read that many, 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 many times, and not until about a dozen years ago that I realized something. I looked up the words used there, bring forth and brought forth. It's real easy to think that it's the same verb. I may imagine my astonishment when I learned that the two verbs there are totally different words. However, they have overlapping meanings. And some of those meanings come out through some of the other translations. The RSV put it as put forth in verse 11. NAS said sprout in verse 11. The NIV says to produce on all of these. And actually, the words elsewhere are translated thrust or shoot, all these kind of things. And again, 2 different words in verses 11 and 12 there. Neither one of these 2 words imply ex nihilo creation, that is, out of nothing. It says the earth brought forth, and the earth did bring forth these things, or shoot or thrust. And what I see here is a very dynamic process. When I really got my head wrapped around this years ago, I sat there in my office and I thought about it. I imagine if I were there, what would it have looked like? And I think it's a lot like a time lapse video. You've seen these where a plant comes climbing up out of the ground and it gains in girth and height. And you can see, maybe weeks of growth taking place in a matter of 20 seconds or so. And I was delighted when Eric Hovind did his Genesis movie in 3D a few years ago, because it's exactly how he portrayed the plants coming shooting up out of the ground. I don't think it was my prompting to do that. I think he understood that from what he studied or other sources. So God didn't make things instantaneously there on day three, the plants. He caused them to grow. Normal growth, but abnormally fast. Was it a physical, natural process? No, it was very miraculous, sped up tremendously. And why was that? Well, in a few days, you're going to have man and beast both requiring that they have these for food. Remember the end of the chapter, first what chapter there says that all the creatures, all the land creatures and such were plant eaters. They weren't carnivorous at all. That didn't come till later apparently. So everybody would have starved. Everybody would have starved because the fastest you can bring a seedling to to fruition is a matter of a couple of months for some vegetable crops, and imagine for years for trees and so forth. So these things had to fulfill their purposes. As I said before, the very good declared there indicates that they fulfilled their purposes and they had to be there. So God rapidly produced those. So could the again abnormally rapid processes, and I think we see that developing through the creation week when God makes the land animals on day five. He formed them out of the dust of the ground as well as he had formed man on day six. Day six, not day five. Day six of creation of land animals and man both came out of the ground as well. Abnormally fast, and maybe this process was used on day four as well. God rapidly brought together the matter to make the moon and the planets and the stars. And at the same time as he did this, perhaps the craters, some of the craters we see, particularly on the moon, but other bodies as well, might be some of the last bits of material brought in. I would think that this rapid directed process would leave behind some evidence of that process, perhaps. Otherwise, you're left with a perfectly spherical cue ball sort of moon, and that's not what the moon looks like at all. So I went out on this about 20 years ago before I have made my suggestion, completed this idea for my light travel time problem. But I'm kind of tying it together with some of the things that I've thought about and written about over the last 20, 25 years. Now, I think the rapid formation of stars took place as well, and galaxies and the whole shebang. The problem is that's fine, but if you've got the Andromeda galaxy or this other pair of galaxies 300 million light years away, um, that doesn't do you much good if you can't see them. So just as God brought forth the plants out of the ground to fulfill their functions, I'm suggesting that God rapidly brought forth those stars, the light of distant objects, brought them to the earth so they too could fulfill their functions there as well. Now, I'm not talking about a physical mechanism uh, by general relativity or by changes in fundamental constants so that you can change the speed of light. I'm talking about a rapid, miraculous process. Remember, we shouldn't be afraid, even though we're scientists, we shouldn't be afraid for the creation week at least to invoke miraculous processes because let's face it, the creation week was miraculous. So I think that what I'm proposing is rapid extension of light to get here from Earth, the bringing forth. I'm going to say extension here, but it doesn't matter. Some people may say, well, wait a minute, that extension sounds like stretching. Maybe that's what was talked about 11 times in the Old Testament, talking about the stretching of the heavens. And I've been tempted to go there, but the problem is if there's anything that sounds like the stretching of the heavens, it's probably the thing that God made on day two, the Rakia, which the King James translated as a firmament. Other early English translations did as well, but it's better translated as expanse, something that's been expanded. Well, expand, stretch, that sounds pretty good. Uh, in fact, at least once in the Old Testament, that is talking about use a different word there. The root word, the verb for rakia, is used to describe how God made the heavens. So I think I would be much more comfortable having that expansion of the heavens taking place on day two, which doesn't do me a bit of good on day four because it's already happened at that point. And this rapid extension would have to be at least by day six, but I suspect it's probably on day four because when those days end, God does usually pronounce on them, it was good. And he does on day 4 as well, unlike on day 2, by the way, which is interesting. So you got, I think, day 4, but certainly by day 6, that this extension is taking place. And again, the heavens stretched. I mentioned that, but keep in mind that that's probably not a good fit. It's more of a day. It's maybe more of a day 2 event that's being talked about. All right, now I can compare this to some of the other solutions, and as I thought about this over the years, I can see some elements of my solution, which, by the way, I call the Dasha solution, or matured, not mature, but matured creation. Dasha is one of the two verbs used there in verses 11 and 12 to bring forth, or sprout, or shoot. So I like that one better than the other Hebrew verb that's used there. But as I look at the other solutions, I can see elements of several of those within my solution. For instance, the white hole cosmology. Um, in fact, when I first was cogitating on this, I got a call from Russ Humphreys, and he was trying to listen to what I had to say as I was just formulating it. And that was, again, at least 10 years ago. And he said, "Well, Danny, I have the physical mechanism for that." And I said, "Well, Russ, you don't understand. I'm not looking for a physical mechanism. I'm looking for the miraculous." We're we're, uh, we're talking maybe the same thing, and to you it sounds like a physical mechanism, but I'm looking at a miraculous thing taking place. I don't need a physical mechanism if it's indeed a miracle. And again, why are we trying to answer this one question in the creation week with a physical mechanism when that we don't do that for anything else during the creation week? And so I really I can see why people may want to go there, but I'm not terribly interested because I think that's really getting into a different direction entirely. Mature creation. Well, I said an alternate term for a name for what I'm proposing is matured past tense creation. Mature creation is the idea that God created the universe fully mature, and I'm saying that God didn't, but He brought it to maturity very quickly, just as He did the plants on day 3. There were little seedlings that popped up out of the ground, but by the end of day 3, they were mature, I believe. So instead of God created the world mature, He matured it very rapidly. And of course, a big difference is, in my estimation, what I'm trying to propose here, the light we see from very distant objects actually did leave those objects, but the mature creation doesn't do that for you. When you look at the Andromeda galaxy today, if the mature creation theory is correct, then we've never actually received any light from the Andromeda galaxy. It falls about 169,000 and what the 100 and my math is 164,000 light years short of that. Excuse me, I'm just blanked out there for a second. And yet I believe the light actually left those stars. So when I see the Andromeda galaxy on a dark night in the autumn, I believe that the Andromeda galaxy is a couple of million light years away from us, but I don't believe the light's been traveling nearly that long. I think it's been traveling something close to 6,000 years to get to us. Big difference between those two. There are other things you might be able to see there. A few other considerations. This is a biggie for me, and have had people ask me this question, and I knew the question before anyone ever asked, but because I thought about it, and this is a very fair question for which I don't have an answer for. Where is the transition between the creation week, that is the miraculous, that stretching or bringing forth of the light, and the current sustaining? Again, Hebrews 1:3, the physics as we now know it. You see, if you've got light coming from the Andromeda galaxy, it's brought here very rapidly, and the light actually left it. But at some point, it's got to go from that rapid bringing here to the stasis we have today. And what would that look like with the light? I haven't a clue what it might look like. I haven't a clue. And that's a bit of a problem. I don't think it's insurmountable, but I just still haven't been able to figure it out. But there should be some sort of transition there. Would that transition necessarily show up as a change in the light? Well, again, I don't know. I would think possibly it could, but it's not fleshed in enough, well enough to understand whether there is such a transition. If so, what that transition might look like. So I'm always a little, I like to talk about this, but again, I have to tell you, I don't have a good answer. I am thinking about it quite a bit, but I don't have a good solution for that yet. And one of the really cool things about this is that I think we're seeing the universe, if this my proposal is correct, or even reasonably correct, I think we're seeing the universe in something close to real time. Again, when I look at the Andromeda galaxy, I'm looking at something that's a couple of million light years away from us, but I think the lights may have been traveling 6,000 years to get here. When you compare 6,000 years to 2 million years, that's real time. Okay, we're not looking at light that's 2 million years old. We're looking at something that's only 6,000 years old. And compared to 2 million years, that is incredibly close to real time. So I'm saying we're seeing the universe in something like real time in all of this. Um, I found that the people ask the question, well, what about the effect of the curse? Supernovae. For instance, I mentioned the supernova visible in the LMC back in 1987, and people say, well, that must have happened before the fall then. Yet, yet here we are. How can you have supernova before the fall? Well, I think that people sometimes misunderstand the implications of the fall. Many people take the very good of the creation week description and equate that with perfection. And then they go on to decide what that perfection must be. It was common at one time in creation circles to suggest that prior to the fall, all crystals were perfect. There were no crystal defects. If you know anything about solid state physics, you know that solid matter is made up of crystals, which is an orderly array of molecules or atoms or units, rows and columns, three-dimensional sorts of stuff. And you have different forms for that. You'll also know that there's no such thing as a perfect crystal. Every crystal has little defects, different kinds of defects. And what this means is that in some place, maybe there's a unit missing, or maybe there's a slip, and you've got this whole plane that's shifted across these things. We use the word defect there. All it means is that it's a deviation from the normal rule that you have. Unfortunately, the word defect also has the connotation of a moral failure. And so I think people are engaging a little bit of equivocation here. They say, okay, very good means perfect, and perfect means you can have no defects, so therefore there couldn't have been any imperfect crystals. And again, that's equivocation, where you're using a term two very different ways. Uh, so were there crystal defects before the fall? Probably. Were there craters on the moon before the fall? I think so. As I pointed out before, I think I've suggested for years now that craters were part of the formation process of the moon and other bodies. And so if you have these craters there, it doesn't. People say, well, a crater, that's like, something slamming into surface. That's a disaster. Well, it might be for creatures living there, but the moon doesn't have any creatures, so I don't see what the problem is. So a lot of things that many people tend to think when their idealized case of what they think the creation should have been like or must have been like are absolutely incorrect. So is a supernova really a problem? I don't see that it is. It's simply following the basic laws of physics as far as we know what caused supernovae. So I don't think that's a problem either. But people have raised that objection, said to me, well, you're having these supernovae before the fall, and that's never a good thing. And I disagree, as I've suggested here. And I question the one question that comes up is the future destruction of the heavens. Does it include the astronomical heavens? And it's surprising to learn that not all creationists believe that. I was surprised. I'm deeply reading into some of Henry Morse's writings that he believed that got to realize that he believed that the heavens created in day one referred to the astronomical realm, and the expansive day two referred to the uh, the atmosphere of the earth. Now I'm going to give my what I think is a proper biblical cosmology tomorrow, or I'm going to change that a bit. But so he believed that he taught that when Second Peter speaks of the heavens passing away, and Isaiah does as well, and a new heaven and a new earth in the Book of Revelation, it's not talking about the astronomical heavens. They will endure. It's the atmospheric heavens that will be changed. And I disagree. I respectfully disagree. But by the way, I've said a couple of things here I've disagreed with Henry Morris on. He was a fine Christian example. I had the privilege of knowing him, and he's a role model for all of us, I think. And he really was a pioneer. But he wasn't right about everything. He was human, like the rest of us are, and he staked out a lot of positions on a lot of things. And so, being a human, he's going to get a few things wrong. I'm not being disrespectful at all. I'm simply uh, saying that his batting average might have been like 950, which is phenomenal, but he still had 50 points. That were not quite right. At the end of my career, if my average is anywhere close to his, I will be ecstatic. So uh, I've been wrong about stuff, and I am wrong about stuff, I'm sure. So please don't anybody take this as being disrespectful. But I do believe the future destruction of the heavens is including the entirety of the universe as we know it, and that's going to have to be rapid. It's going to have to be real rapid. It speaks of the heavens being rolled up like a scroll. I think it's going to be violent. It's going to be surprising. It's going to be fast when it happens. And I view the creation as being like two bookends. You've got one on one side, one on the other, and one was very rapid. The other one is very rapid. There are some Christians out there, I could name names, but I won't, who teach that the Big Bang happened and the creation was very gradual over billions of years, but the end will be rather sudden. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. If one's sudden, why shouldn't the other one be sudden as well? So I think it really shares in all of this. And in my discussions of this, I've had some of my creation science brethren, typically the physics people, that look askant at this. They don't really engage me much on it, but I overheard one of them once saying, "Well, Danny's just saying God did it," and I think he meant that as a criticism. Um, but yeah, that's what that's the point. Is again, we have the creation week is a miraculous thing. I think it's far more miraculous than some of us realize. So it's a little odd, perhaps, for a physical scientist to be invoking a miracle, but on the other hand, we are creationists. We're biblical creationists, and we should recognize readily how much the role of the miraculous during this time.